Okay, so to start off, let me introduce myself. I'm Olivia. I'm a high school junior, and I'm a political writer for our organization, Girls for Politics. We basically write and blog about political events and try to educate people about what's going on in the world. And the goal of our organization is kind of to encourage women and girls to get more involved in the field of politics. So to start off,
Where are
could
you
you,
located?
yes?
Where are you located?
We're kind of more of a digital organization, but I live in the Bay Area in California.
Okay, great. I'm gonna see if I can get away from the sunlight here. Yeah,
Great. So to start off with, could you give a short introduction of yourself and kind of what you do in politics and your background?
sure. So I have had many experiences in politics. My name's Karen Liftin, and I'm a full professor at the University of Washington in the Department of Political Science. I've been teaching there since 1991. I got my PhD from UCLA in that same year, and I had worked for about 7 years as a full-time political activist in Southern California. I started with my best friend from high school, actually. The two of us started an organization that was aiming towards trying to convert military industries to doing peaceful production in Southern California. And we also did a lot of educational work on nuclear weapons and nuclear disarmament. That's not something that young people think about all that much these days, but when I was a young person, it looked very likely that we would have an all-out war with the Soviet Union, nuclear war with the Soviet Union. So that felt like the most pressing, urgent issue of the day. And then the Cold War ended, and I wanted to write my dissertation on an area that felt a little more hopeful to me. And it seemed to me that with the end of the Cold War, that the world could really turn its attention to problems that we have in common. And because we live on we share the planet, and we share the atmosphere. And so I wrote my dissertation, which became my first book, on stratospheric ozone depletion and how the treaties that were developed by under the auspices of the United Nations Environment Program actually helped to save the ozone layer. And hardly anybody knows about that. So we think about climate change, but if we didn't have those treaties in place, we actually wouldn't have the luxury to be thinking so much about climate change these days, because we would be being fried by the sun's ultraviolet radiation. So I've been teaching at the University of Washington for almost 30 years. Um, and yeah, I mean, I've taught so many classes, human rights, women's studies, but almost all of my classes these days are about global environmental politics. So I think a lot about climate change and issues of biodiversity and the fact that we're entering into this new geological epoch called the Anthropocene. I don't know if you're familiar with that term. Um, but anyway, that's a little bit about me.
Yeah, so that how you got started in politics sounds really interesting. Was that activism? I'm sorry, I forgot. Was it high school or college? Was it that activism that got you interested in politics?
So I would say it was the politics that got me interested in activism. When I just looked at the world, it seemed to me that there were terrible injustices. And I remember feeling very impatient when I was in college to do something about these issues rather than just study them. And I felt some impatience with my professors. They were all brilliant and very theoretical and very philosophically inclined. And my sense was like, let's go do something about this instead of just theorizing about it. So as soon as I got out of college, I went from the East Coast to the West Coast, landed in Southern California, which is kind of the belly of the beast when it comes to military production. And there I met up with my dearest friend from high school, and the two of us started this organization together. So So yeah, I would say just looking at the political situation is what made me get active. And um, I also teach environmental studies. And one of the things that I've noticed, especially with environmental studies students, is that until recently, there was not a big interest in politics because there's a feeling like, well, if you want to save the environment, you just become a vegan and take shorter showers and ride a bicycle. But I think now it's become really apparent that our problems are truly systemic. And so there's no like individual solution anymore. There never was, but we can't live under that illusion anymore. We really need to be thinking politically. So I'm just going to put a little bit more light on this. So now, and I would say especially since the 2016 election, I don't feel like I have to persuade my students anymore that politics is important. I mean, I think it's really obvious, and I think the fact that your organization exists attests to that fact.
So why would you say you went into academia and teaching politics?
Well, I was, as I mentioned, a full-time activist, and then I got a large grant from the California Council for the Humanities in 1984, 85, 83, something in there. It was a 2-year project to put together a series of workshops and conferences all over the state of California called The Fate of the Earth, Human Values in the Nuclear Age. And when I did that, I ran about 30 conferences and workshops all over the state. And it was very inspiring. It was pre-internet, everything was done by phone calls and snail mail. And it was very exciting. And one of the things that I noticed during one of the talks in particular, the speaker was really disappointing. He was just plain boring. And I thought, I have more to say about this than that guy does. The only reason he's on the stage and I'm not is that I don't have a PhD. So I went back to college and I got my PhD and became an academic. And even when I was an activist, my nickname in the organization that I was working with was Professor. They always called me the professor because I was kind of brainy and always had big ideas, um, and always liked to read a lot. So I thought, well, as a professor, you get long contact with students. We're on the quarter system, so I have I have 10 weeks with my students instead of just going out and giving one, public speech where I'll never see those people again, very likely. I get to work intensively with young people who are just finding their identity in this complex world. And I get to really, I think, have a ripple effect that way. So I think of education as like kind of planting seeds. It's a long-term project, but you plant the seeds and you see what grows. And I have actually been teaching. I was started teaching part-time even when I was an activist. So I've been teaching since 1974, which is a long time. Sometimes I think of retiring. We'll see. But you know, I have had my finger on the pulse of this generation, 18 to 23-year-olds, all that time. And I've really noticed some big changes during that time. And it seems to me that nowadays young people, maybe partly because of the internet, are able to think more connectively, are able to make connections and really start looking at the bigger systemic problems that we're facing. So I'm very excited actually right now to be teaching in these times because there's so much at play. I would say possibly even the future of our species. And so it's a very exciting time to be teaching.
So I'm not sure if you said you taught anywhere else besides the University of Washington, but is there anything about the school or your role there that really is unique or sets it apart?
Well, I have taught in a number of different universities. I was teaching even as a graduate student at the University of Maryland, and yeah, so I have taught at USC, UCLA, um, and I've done visiting lectures in many universities, including in quite a few in Europe. But um, I would say at the University of Washington, part of what makes me unusual is that I integrate contemplative practices into my teaching, which maybe, do you know what I'm talking about? Maybe your
I
audience
don't think
knows.
so.
So, okay, so when we study global environmental issues, we tend to think that there's something that those things, or just in any kind of global issue, human rights, immigration, whatever, that's happening out there in the world. And but once you learn about these things, they're happening inside. And so I'm intensely interested in the internal experience of my students. So how does it affect their emotions? What kind of impact does it have even in their bodies when they take this information in? And some of this is overwhelming information like climate change, biodiversity, species extinctions and plastic in the oceans, et cetera. I mean, there's a lot of overwhelming stuff going on in the world. So my interest in is how can we learn this potentially daunting material in ways that are empowering and help us feel more connected to life rather than feeling more and more disconnected. So contemplative practices, actually, we often turn off our cameras when we're doing it on Zoom. If I'm doing it in a big lecture hall, I will turn off the lights and invite students to close their eyes and tune into their breath and tune into their own internal somatic experience and really connect on an emotional level with what it is that we're talking about. So I call that the inner curriculum. The inner curriculum is how whatever you're learning out there in the world is landing inside yourself. Because I actually believe we are challenged now to become different kinds of human beings than we've ever been before. And that requires a whole lot more self-awareness. Also requires resilience skills. So we're going into a world where the climate will be destabilized. Even if we act very quickly, we're in the realm now of climate destabilization to some extent. We can do a lot to make that less harmful, but we're going to need resilience skills. We're going to need to know how to be courageous, how to find peace in ourselves when the times are turbulent, how to work with our anxiety, how to work with our guilt. So all of this, you ask me, how am I a little different perhaps from my colleagues? I think that this is partly why I'm a little different, but um, a lot of faculty are really finding great value in this now, as are students, because there's a recognition that we need these inner skills and not just technological and analytical skills.
Yeah, so earlier you mentioned that you felt that some speakers were being too theoretical or your professors. Can you talk a bit about any field work or kind of research that you particularly have enjoyed or are proud of?
Thank you. Well, that's a nice little opportunity. Well, so my first book, as I mentioned, was on the ozone treaties. And I was really interested in the possibilities for international law to help human systems to harmonize with the Earth system. And over the course of like the next 10 years or so, what I saw is that international law wasn't enough because it was moving too slowly, and it was, in order to get all countries to agree to a treaty, or even most countries, you have to kind of water down the treaty enough so that they're willing to sign on. And so I became interested in this question that I found it was really compelling to me. Who in the world is actually living in a way that could be viable into the human future? In other words, who's living sustainably, or at least really trying to? And I discovered the global eco-village movement. And so these are communities all over the world. There's thousands of them, small, a lot of them are small. Some of them might only be 10 people. Some of them are hundreds or even thousands of people, but they're trying to live sustainably. And by sustainably, I don't just mean ecologically sustainably, but also in terms of their human relationships, and developing the kind of skills that I was just talking about, the resiliency skills. So I actually, and I was a single mom at the time. I had a daughter who, when you invited me to be on this interview, I thought about her because she's also been a kind of girl in politics and following me around the world and stuff, with my travels. So I traveled around the world living in eco villages, and I lived in probably about 20 eco villages around the world over the course of a year. So only 14 of them made it into the book, but I documented ways that communities are pioneering um, sustainability on the ground. So this is like, I could spell out all kinds of theories about why this is important and what it means for the human future and what it means philosophically, but they're doing it on the ground in terms of their everyday lives, in terms of what they eat, how they do their transportation, where they get their water, what they do with their waste, all of this, how they treat their soil, et cetera, et cetera. So it's very grounded. And when I came back from that journey, I realized I wanted to live more that way too. And so I started a farming community on an island just outside of Seattle. And that community never became the intentional community that I was hoping it would become, but it is a very vibrant farm. I no longer live there. I ended up selling the farm to the farmers because actually I had no business owning a farm anyway. Um, but I feel like it's really important for me to walk my talk. So if I see that actually people need to start living in a way that's more in harmony with the earth, well, heck, I want to live that way too.
Yeah, that sounds really incredible that farming community started. Um, you mentioned your daughter. In general, do you have any advice for young women or young adults who want to go into politics or maybe study it in college and possibly go into academia?
Well, actually, I first of all have some advice to their parents,
Okay.
which is like listen to especially what I think, having raised a daughter. I think at some point I really remember thinking, if we just put 10-year-old girls, 10 to 12-year-old girls in charge of the world, usually before adolescence, because adolescence kind of riles everything up. But if you just put 10 to 12-year-old girls in charge of the world, we'd be fine. I remember when I was traveling in India with my daughter, and we we were completely grounded. There was a transport workers strike, and we couldn't go anywhere. And there were demonstrations on the street, and they were big and loud, and we didn't understand a word that they were speaking. We were in the state of Kerala at the time, and they were speaking Malayalam. And I said to my daughter, "What do you think they're saying?" And she said, "I know what they're saying. They're saying, 'We're right and you're wrong. We're right and you're wrong.'" and, and it's true. That's what they were saying. Now, those demonstrators, they probably were right in terms of justice, but there's this kind of understanding of politics as being very oppositional, and she could see through it right away at the age of 10. Um, so anyway, but I kind of evaded your question. What advice would I give girls? So I would give the advice to really pay attention and to just look at the world and trust your instincts, because I believe girls have profound instincts about how to care for the world. And you girls are going to be the women who are doing that in the world. you know, um, I did have a child, but I also think that maybe it's not just girls and women. On some level, we all have this kind of impulse to care for the world and make it a better place. And so if we put our minds at the service of that vision, I think we really can make the world a better place. Um, so I would say, you know, whatever you do in terms of getting your skills, making yourself marketable, getting a degree, passing the standardized tests and all the things that you got to do to, jump through all those hoops. Do not lose your contact with your heart. Keep that really at the forefront and find other people, girls, whoever, who can be in community with you because we can't do this alone.
Yeah, I think that's all the questions I had, but is there anything else you wanted to say?
Well, gosh, I just really appreciate that you're out there doing what you do. And I hope you inspire a lot of people. And I love the fact that you're doing this in the pandemic when everything's happening on Zoom. And so you're really making good use of this technology, which I think is super important. People can feel so disconnected these days. I think the challenge is to really reconnect ourselves to each other and to the earth and to all of our systems. And yeah, politics is how we do that. So, yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, and thank you for taking the time to talk with us. And this is really interesting. I loved hearing about your experience and your background in traveling. It sounds really, really fascinating.
Yeah, well, good luck to you.
Thank you.
Okay, bye.
Bye.